The request came in on a Tuesday. I know that because I was running the weekly logistics audit when it hit my queue, and I remember being annoyed at the interruption. Auxiliary Command had been pushing us to clear the backlog before the Reach resupply rotation, and I had 3 hours of inventory flags to reconcile before end of shift. So when the amber notification pulsed at the edge of my console, first instinct was to send it to the duty officer and finish my work. I didn't. I don't know why. Some captains will tell you. There are moments you recognize in the moment. The small hinge on which something large is about to swing. I am not usually that kind of captain. I finish my audits, I close my queues in order, but I read that request and something in the plain, exhausted language of it stopped me cold. It was filed under Compact Humanitarian Protocol 7, Subclause 9, the lowest priority tier, reserved for what the protocol architects had charitably called non-emergency supplemental medical liaison requests. Kind of request the Compact's routing algorithm would normally hold in a buffer for 60 to 90 standard days before generating an automated response. It had already been in the system for 11 days before it reached my queue, which meant someone, somewhere, had manually kicked it upward rather than let it sit. I noted that, and read on. The Velskar continuance had been transmitting distress notifications to Compact Emergency Coordination for 6 months. Not one notification. Not a weekly update. 6 months of sequential, escalating, formally worded pleas. Each more precisely desperate than the last. Each one answered with what the Compact's office called an acknowledgement of receipt and an expression of coordinated concern. The continuance had documented atmospheric processors failing across 3 of their 4 primary orbital stations. They had documented the cascade effect on the lower atmosphere of Continuance Prime. Particulate filtration was degrading at a rate that would render the surface uninhabitable for their crystalline substrate biology within 18 to 24 months. They had documented the medical burden, the silicate tissue degradation among the civilian population already underway, the overloaded care lattices, the growing tally of Velskar, whose silicon-bonded cellular architecture was beginning to fracture under prolonged atmospheric stress. They had sent atmospheric readings, medical logs, engineering assessments, population projections, detailed technical specifications for the remediation equipment that would be needed. The Compact had sent expressions of coordinated concern. After 6 months of that, someone in the Continuance's External Affairs office had apparently sat down at a terminal, looked at the directory of every species with auxiliary access credentials, and filed the lowest possible tier supplemental medical request to the Human Convalescent Auxiliary. Not to the Compact's emergency desk, to any of the major species with actual fleet capacity. To us. I later found out that the Velskar filing officer, a junior administrator named Sekvorth Ilian, who had never personally interacted with a human, chose the auxiliary essentially because it was alphabetically proximate to the top of the access directory, and she had run out of better options. She told me this herself, later, with what I can only describe as mortified candor. She had chosen us the way you might choose the last tool in a drawer. Not because you believe it will work, but because you have already tried everything else, and the drawer is empty, and you still have to try. She had not expected a response. She had filed the request the way you throw a coin into a dry fountain, not because you believe it works, but because you have tried everything else, and the ritual of trying still feels better than sitting still. I flagged the request as priority 1 and sent it up the chain. I wrote 2 lines in the routing note. I said, "The requesting party has been in the Compact queue for 6 months, with documented atmospheric failure and active population medical burden." I said, "Technical specifications in their supporting documents are precise and actionable." I sent it. That was the Tuesday. What happened next took 8 days, and I was only partially informed of it in real time. Command forwarded the request to U.S. Fleet Coordination. Fleet Coordination reviewed the atmospheric data and the medical burden, projections, and escalated to the Combined Auxiliary Response Office, which has authority to requisition assets across the full breadth of human, relief, and engineering infrastructure. The Combined Response Office apparently ran the Velskar's technical specifications through their equipment, allocation model which cross-references documented need against available asset types, produced a deployment recommendation within 36 hours. I know this because I received a burst transmission 6 days after my flag, informing me that I was being temporarily assigned as mission lead for what the transmission called a coordinated light assistance deployment, standing engagement posture. The transmission included an attachment, a manifest. I opened it expecting a frigate, maybe a frigate and a tender. That would have been a reasonable response to a Protocol 7 medical request. That would have been more than the Velskar had received from anyone else in 6 months. The manifest listed 47 vessels. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because I assumed I was misreading the deployment scope or conflating it with an unrelated operation. I was not. 47 hulls, 8 hospital ships of the Nightingale class, each configured for xenophysiological triage with modular internal environments, adaptable to silicon substrate biology, 14 atmospheric processing rigs, the heavy industrial kind, not the portable units, the ones that required dedicated tugcraft to maneuver into orbital insertion, the ones rated for full planetary scale atmospheric reformation at a throughput of 60 million cubic kilometers per operational cycle. 11 engineering corps transports carrying full surface deployment teams with atmosphere reconstruction toolkits rated for silicate world geology. 7 supply convoys carrying materials I will come to presently. 4 science vessels carrying atmospheric chemists and silicate biology specialists, including 2 researchers who had published work specifically on crystalline physiology atmosphere sensitivity, and 3 U.S. ski escort cruisers, included as the manifest notation blandly explained as standard safety perimeter for a multi-hull relief convoy in an unsecured operational zone. The supply convoys alone were worth noting. They were not carrying generic humanitarian rations and field medical kits, the kind of default load that gets packed when no one has read the specific request. They were carrying the components for semi-permanent atmospheric monitoring stations, calibrated for silicate atmosphere interaction. They were carrying silicon lattice medical substrates, the specialized biological matrix material that Velskar Tromsmuff medicine uses the way human medicine uses sterile bandaging. They were carrying construction-grade atmospheric sealants, filtration membrane stock, and compression drive components for the Kellerman series reformers that the Velskar's own engineers had specified in their technical documents. Someone had read every page of every transmission the Velskar had sent. The cover note from Combined Response read, "Captain Fenwick, you are designated mission lead for Auxiliary Relief Deployment 79er. Deployment classified as light assistance, standing posture. Full operational authority delegated to your discretion. Vessels en route to your position. ETA 8 days from this transmission. Recommend advance contact with receiving party to coordinate docking protocols. Light assistance, standing posture." I sat with that phrase for a long time. I have been in the auxiliary for 19 years. I have run refugee resettlement operations, plague response deployments, famine convoys. I know what the words mean in context. Standing posture means the fleet has not gone to maximum commitment. Light means someone at Combined Response looked at the situation and decided this was an appropriate first response, not the full measure of what could be sent. They sent 47 ships and called it the light option. I composed my advance contact to the Velskar Sur station and kept the manifest attachment off the initial transmission. I wanted to give them time to prepare. I worded it carefully, in the formal compact standard contact protocol, identifying myself and my assignment, and requesting docking clearance and a liaison point of contact for logistics coordination. I did not tell them how many ships were coming. I thought, in retrospect naively, that this might be easier to absorb in person. Response from Velskar Orbital Station Continuant 7 came back within 4 hours. Given that they had been waiting for any substantive response for 6 months, I imagined someone was watching that channel closely. The reply was formal, precise, and carried beneath its diplomatic surface language something I can only describe as stunned disbelief that I was writing to them at all. My liaison contact would be Station Commander Isaveth Keln of the 3rd Lattice. Docking clearance was granted for your vessel and any accompanying support craft. I did not correct the singular. I thanked them for the clearance and confirmed our ETA. The 8 days of transit were useful for coordination work I could not have done after arrival. I ran briefings with the hospital ship lead surgeons. There were 16 of them from 8 different ships, and getting them on a common operational picture for xenosilicon triage protocols took 3 sessions and a great deal of coffee. Ran briefings with the atmospheric rig deployment leads, who had opinions about insertion orbit sequencing that required mediation. I ran briefings with Chief Warrant Officer Bramley's Engineering Corps team and with the 4 science vessels' senior researchers, and I reviewed the full body of the Velskar's technical transmissions, all 6 months of them, in the order they were sent. Reading them in sequence was a different experience from reading the summary that had come to me on a Tuesday. The summary had been enough to flag the request. The full sequence was something else. You could watch, across those months of documents, the quality of the Velskar's precision degrade slightly as their fatigue increased, and then firm back up again because whatever they were feeling, they were professionals and they kept their documentation professional. You could watch the atmospheric numbers worsen week by week, the medical intake numbers grow, the projections tighten. You could watch a species document their own emergency with meticulous care, send the documentation to the correct addresses, and receive nothing actionable in return. You could watch them keep sending anyway. I found that I could not read it casually. I found that I kept stopping and sitting with a paragraph, or a data table, and feeling a quality of attention that I do not usually bring to pre-mission reading, which is normally about extraction of operational parameters. This was not that. This was reading the record of something that should not have been permitted to reach this point, trying to understand how it had, and finding that the how was not complicated. The how was a cue. The how was a process. The how was the accumulated weight of procedures that were designed to allocate limited resources fairly, and had, over time, simply become the way things were. I finished the last transmission the day before we reached the system. The 47 ships folded in on schedule, in a staggered sequence that spread the emergence events across approximately 40 minutes of real space-time. I was on my bridge, the coordination feed, watching the tactical plot fill in the way water fills a low place. First one marker, then 3, then a cluster, then a steady accumulation that did not stop. I was trying to manage the fold sequencing and coordinate the hospital ship's holding pattern above the planetary atmosphere and run the preliminary contact protocols with the engineering corps, leads all at once, which is the unglamorous reality of leading a large relief deployment. But in the gaps between coordination calls, I watched the long-range visual feed from the station's exterior sensor array, which my junior comms officer, Petty Officer Urasi, had patched through to the secondary display above my station. She had a feel for these moments. I did not thank her in the moment because I was on a channel with the rig deployment leads, but I have thanked her since. I watched, in that secondary window, the way the human convoy looked from the outside as it assembled. I have never seen it from the outside before. You don't, when you're running it. You see the manifest, the tactical plot, the coordination channels. You see the work. You don't see what it looks like to the people watching from a crystalline observation deck above a dying world. When the first ship comes out of fold L, and then the second, and then the ships keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. My secondary display was patched to the station's external array, but I learned later, from Isaveth Keln herself, what it looked like from the observation deck. She told me she had been on that deck since before our advance contact arrived. She had not left it in the 6 months since they began transmitting to the compact. Not really. She had slept in a field rest station 2 corridors away and eaten at a console and spent every waking hour either managing the station's deteriorating systems or standing at the transparent hull, watching the space where help was not coming from. The observation deck of Continuant 7 was the Velskar's finest architectural achievement in orbit, a great sweep of void transparent silicate hull that wrapped 3/4 of the station's outer ring, showing the full panorama of Continuance Prime below, and the transit approaches in every direction. The planet was visible through it, And even from orbit, the atmospheric degradation was apparent to the naked eye. The brown-gray haze that had thickened over the past year, occluding the deep amber crystal color that Velskar atmospheric science uses as the baseline measure of healthy particulate composition. She had watched that color go wrong, slowly over 14 months. She had documented it in 38 separate atmospheric reports, each one filed to the Compact's coordination desk, each one acknowledged. She was standing at that hull when my ship came out of fold. She told me her first thought was, "It is the human ship, the small one it came." She said there was relief in that, not great relief, not the relief that ends suffering, but the quiet relief of not having been entirely ignored. Something had come. A human frigate, perhaps. A tender with some medical supplies and a specialist or two. It would not be enough. She knew, with the clarity of someone who had been calculating insufficiency for months, that a single ship would not be enough to stop what was happening to her world. But it was something. It was a response. After 6 months of acknowledgement and concern, something had responded. Then the second ship emerged, then the third. She said she did not count. At first, she watched. The Velskar continuance is a species for whom large numbers are not inherently impressive. They have watched galactic fleets maneuver for political purposes, have seen the Compact's ceremonial formations, have attended the great conjunction displays that species stage at diplomatic summits. Numbers by themselves do not move the Velskar. What moves the Velskar is precision, the quality of attention, the specificity of care, the evidence that a thing has been thought about rather than merely sent. She said she started on Sarstan somewhere around the 8th or 9th ship, when the configuration of the convoy began to be legible. These were not combat vessels. The long, ventral structures of the Nightingale-class hospital ships were recognizable to her from Compact medical directories she had consulted during the crisis. She had spent months researching what kind of help might theoretically exist for a species in the continuance's situation, reading equipment specifications and cross-referencing capabilities against what her own engineers had calculated was needed. She knew what a Xeno-configured hospital ship looked like. She knew what atmospheric processing rigs looked like. She had included detailed technical specifications in her own distress transmissions, describing exactly what kind of equipment was needed and why, specifying the Kellerman Series 14-ring reformers by model number, citing their throughput ratings and their compatibility with silicate atmospheric chemistry. She recognized, one by one, the ships she had described in her requests, not approximations, not adjacent capabilities, not a general class of hospital vessel that might be adapted. The things she had specified, precise tools her engineers had calculated were needed, were resolving out of fold in front of her, and they were still coming. By the time she had counted 20, she said her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She was at pains to tell me this later, that it was not fear. The Velskar do not have the fluid biology that produces what humans call tears. But she described a pressure in her resonance lattice, a vibration in the crystalline substructure of her face, that she said her species associates with profound involuntary emotion. The resonance structures of the Velskar face are part of their communication system. Subtle variations in their vibration carry meaning, and they are visible to other Velskar the way facial expressions are visible to humans. She said she had not felt that vibration since her lattice bonding ceremony is the closest thing the Velskar have to a moment of spiritual culmination. She was feeling it watching my fleet come in. She counted 30. She counted 35. She said she had to sit down, which is not something Velskar typically do. Their silicate-jointed physiology is not built sitting, and they generally regard it as an undignified posture. But she sat on the structural lip of the observation deck, and she kept counting, and the ships kept coming. When the last one resolved, she sat there for a long time without moving. 2 officers who had been on the deck with her told her, later, that they had watched her count and then stop moving, and had not known what to do. They had stood near her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would fit inside what they were all looking at. She told me this detail when she recounted the story. She told it without emotion, not because she did not have emotion about it, because she was Velskar, and the Velskar recounts such things factually, and the facts carry what they need to carry. I did not know any of this at the time. At the time I was coordinating docking sequences and running logistics calls and trying to get the atmospheric processing rig leads to agree on an insertion orbit that the engineering core could actually work from. Relief deployments of this scale generate administrative complexity in direct proportion to their size, and the first 48 hours of Deployment 79er were the hardest administrative 48 hours of my career. Was on 4 simultaneous communication channels for most of it. I ate twice. I slept for 3 the first night on a cot in the secondary communications room. Because my cabin was occupied by the logistics coordination terminals I had commandeered for mission management, there is very little dignity in commanding a large operation at the working level. The dignity, if there is any, lives in the outcome. It does not live in the 48 hours of scheduling calls and docking protocol disputes and supply, manifest discrepancies that precede the outcome. Isabeth Keln and I did not meet in person until the second day. She came to my ship rather than receiving me at the station, a formality of the Velskar tradition that I had been briefed on, in which the host comes to the guest in recognition that the guest has traveled far. She arrived with a small delegation, 2 station officers and an atmospheric systems engineer named Tessevar Keln of the 5th, who had been the primary author of the continuances, technical distress documents, the engineer who had run the atmospheric models, calculated the equipment specifications, and written the precise, technically irreproachable documents that had been sent to the compact for 6 months and acknowledged without action. Tessevar Keln looked at me when she was introduced and said, in compact standard very quietly, "You brought the rigs," I said. "Yes," she said. "The exact rigs. The Kellerman Series 14-ring atmospheric reformers. I specified those. In the 3rd transmission, and again in the 5th, and again in the 9th. I specified them by model number and throughput rating and compatibility coefficient," I said. "I know." Our equipment allocation team read the specifications. The manifest was built to match your technical requirements. She did not say anything else for a moment. I watched her. The Velskar are beautiful in a way that is hard to articulate to someone who has not seen them. Their physiology is built on a silicon lattice framework that refracts light through their exterior surface structure, and when they are calm and regulated, the refraction produces a kind of soft internal luminescence, as though they are lit from somewhere inside. When they are under stress, the luminescence dims and the surface structure tightens into what looks like cracked glass, the light going inward and staying there rather than reaching the surface. Tessevar Keln had clearly been under stress for a very long time. The surface was tight and dim when she came aboard. The light in her was compressed into a hard interior point, barely visible through the damage of 14 months of crisis documentation and unanswered expertise. But standing there, hearing me confirm that someone had read her specifications, that the model numbers she had researched and cited had been read by a human equipment allocation team and acted on, something in her lattice shifted, the compression released, not all at once, not dramatically, gradually, the way a material under stress releases when the load is finally removed. A slow relaxation that moves from the core outward. The light began to come back. I found that hard to look at, for reasons I could not immediately name. I looked at it anyway, because it seemed important not to look away from it. Isabeth Keln was more composed. She was the station commander, and she had the practiced stillness that station commanders acquire through years of being the one who cannot afford to be undone by things that undo other people. She greeted me with the formal Velskar acknowledgement of hospitality received, a slow rotation of the anterior resonance plates that functioned something like a bow, and thanked me for the auxiliary's response. Her language was precise, formal, correct. She was giving me the professional acknowledgement, and setting aside the things she had felt on the observation deck, the way professionals set aside the things that cannot be said in professional contexts. We went to my briefing room, and I walked her through the deployment manifest. I had a visual display ready, a 3-dimensional tactical overview of the convoy's current positions, the atmospheric rig deployment sequence, the hospital ship triage configurations, the engineering core surface teams that had already begun prep for the first atmospheric reconstruction phase. I talked through it the way I would with any operational counterpart, methodically, attention to the timeline and the specific capability each element brought. She listened. She asked questions. Questions were very good, specific, technically grounded. The questions of someone who had spent 6 months thinking about exactly this problem and knew what to look for. She asked about the reformer insertion angles and whether the sequence accounted for the retrograde atmospheric rotation in the northern hemisphere. She asked about the hospital ship's intake capacity per standard day and whether the silicon lattice substrate supply was calibrated to population density by region. She asked about the surface team's geological assessment protocol, specifically whether they had access to the deep scan data her engineers had compiled 18 months ago, before the crisis was critical. I had the deep scan data. Our pre-mission prep team had pulled every document the Continuance had ever filed with the Compact's technical registry, including documents filed years before the crisis began, because that is what the prep team does. She had not expected that. I watched her absorb it. We agreed on the coordination protocols between her station personnel and my teams. I assigned her a direct liaison on each of the 8 hospital ships and a joint operations coordinator for the engineering core surface work, which would require close integration with the Volskar's own ground teams, who knew the surface geology in ways no imported specialist could match, in the available time. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. She said, "Captain Fenwick, we filed a Protocol 7 request. We were advised, when we registered with the Auxiliary Access System, that Protocol 7 is for supplemental, non-emergency liaison support. The standard response is 1 to 2 advisory personnel and a logistics assessment. We filed it because we had exhausted every other option, and it seemed better than nothing." She paused. The light in her lattice did something complex. Not the sharp pulse of crisis, but a slow, careful examination of something that did not fit into any category she had prepared for it. Why did Earth send this? I thought about how to answer that, for a moment. There are answers I could have given that would have been more eloquent, or more diplomatic, or more calibrated to the emotional weight of the question. I have thought about this conversation many times since, and I have sometimes imagined giving those other answers. What I actually said was, because your specifications were accurate and your situation was real. When our equipment allocation team read your technical documents, they knew what you needed. The response that came back was sized to the need. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "The Compact also read our technical documents." I said, "I know." They sent expressions of coordinated concern. I said, "Yes." Another silence. Then, 47 ships. She said, "Earth saw crisis as a light response." I said, "The combined response assessment was that your situation warranted immediate full capability deployment within light posture parameters. A heavy posture deployment would have included a colonization support infrastructure and a permanent atmospheric maintenance core. I watched that land. The Velskar resonance lattice produces visible responses to strong emotional input that have been well documented in xenobiological literature, but which are in person far more arresting than any documentation prepared me for. When Isavith heard that a heavy deployment would have been larger than what was currently distributed across 47 hulls in orbit above. Dying world, I watched the light inside her pulse once. Sharply, like a struck crystal. Not a fracture, not damage. The sharp, clear resonance of something hit at exactly its natural frequency, she said. "There is a heavier option," I said. "There are several. Combined response scales to the assessed need." The standing posture was assessed as appropriate because your atmospheric situation, while severe, is within the correctional parameters of the current asset set within your projected timeline. If the rig deployment data shows us behind the degradation curve after the first 30 days, we reassess and escalate. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been managing this station for 11 years, Captain. I have worked within Compact protocols for my entire career. When a species requests assistance, the Compact conducts a needs assessment, which takes between 60 and 120 days, after which the request enters a priority queue which has a current backlog of approximately 3 years. She paused. We had calculated that we would lose the atmosphere before the queue resolved. That was our internal projection. We did not include it in our compact submissions because we had been advised that projections of that kind would be classified as advocacy and might delay processing. I said nothing. She said, "You received our request 11 days ago." I said, "Yes." "And you are here?" I said, "Yes." She looked at the tactical display. The atmospheric processing rigs were visible on it. 14 bright signatures in orbital insertion track above Continuance Prime, already beginning their preliminary atmospherics sampling runs. The reformers, cycling through the warm-up sequence that precedes operational output. The hospital ships were visible, holding in low orbit, their triage configurations online. Their first intake coordinators already in contact with the station's medical lattice teams, already receiving the initial patient transfer manifests. The engineering core transports were visible. 2 of them already in descent trajectory toward the surface reconstruction zones, their approach paths threading through the brown-gray degradation layer like needles pulling thread. She said, "Why?" And I knew she was not asking for logistical reasoning. She had understood the logistics. She was asking something else. The question that sits underneath logistics, the one that does not have a procedural answer. I said, "Commander, our equipment allocation team has a saying. It comes from a very old Earth principle about emergency response. I am paraphrasing. The sense of it is, the response should be sized to the need, not to the expectation," she said. "The compact sizes responses to the expectation." Said, "I know. You size them to the need." I said, "We try to." She rotated her anterior plates again, not the formal bow this time. Something slower, more deliberate, that my briefing notes had identified as a gesture of deep acknowledgement between Velskar of significant, standing used in formal context when words are assessed as insufficient. I was not sure I had earned it. I said so. She said, "You are here. Your rigs are in our sky. 3 hours ago I watched your hospital ships begin receiving my people. I watched your engineers land on a surface I was told could not be reconstructed within a viable timeline. You are here." Another slow rotation. "You have earned it." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which I think was the correct choice. We spent another hour in logistics coordination, and then she returned to the station. I went back to my bridge and spent the rest of the day on coordination calls. Over the next 3 weeks I watched the atmospheric processors work. I say watched, but that is somewhat generous. I monitored the data, which is more accurate. The daily atmospheric column readings came through on the station feed, and I reviewed them each morning with my science liaison team and the Scare's own atmospheric specialists, who joined the daily briefings from the second day onward, once it became clear that the joint operation was seeding and that their expertise was genuinely being integrated rather than politely received and set aside. Those briefings were some of the more useful meetings I have run in my career. The Velskar atmospheric specialists knew their planet's chemistry with a specificity that no imported expert could match, and they had been documenting its deterioration with a precision that translated directly into better operational targeting for the reformer. Deployment. My science lead, a researcher named Dr. Patience Osibonsu, spent the first 3 days in continuous joint session with their lead atmospheric chemist and came out of it with a reformer positioning adjustment that improved the projected correction timeline by 11 days. The numbers moved in the direction we needed them to move. Not fast atmospheric reconstruction at this scale is not fast but steady. The Kellerman series 14-ring reformers that Tessa Varkeln had specified were performing at their rated output, which meant the degradation curve was being countered, and, by the end of the first 30 days, actually reversed. The hospital ships ran continuous intake for the first 2 weeks, and then began transitioning some patients to outpatient status as the atmospheric improvement became measurable at the surface level. The silicate tissue degradation that had been accumulating in the civilian population begins to reverse when the particulate environment improves, and the improvement was reaching the surface within the first week of rig operation, ahead of projections. The engineering core teams on the surface were doing harder work than anything visible in the data. I made one surface trip partway through the deployment, riding down in a logistics shuttle with a supply manifest and I walked through 2 of the reconstruction zones with Chief Warrant Officer Bramley. He had been doing this kind of work for 23 years and spoke about atmospheric reconstruction the way a careful craftsman speaks about trade, with a kind of quiet authority and a complete absence of drama. He showed me where the old processing infrastructure had failed. The fracture points in the filtration lattice, the places where the Velskar's own engineering teams had done everything they could with what they had and then done more. He did not use the word heroic. He used the word professional, which in his vocabulary carried the same weight. He showed me the jury-rigged bypass systems the Velskar engineers had constructed when the primary filtration matrices went offline, the improvised pressure regulation mechanisms built from components that were not designed for the purpose, the manual override systems that had kept parts of the atmospheric network running on direct manual interventions long after the automated systems failed. Someone had been working 12-hour shifts on those manual overrides for 8 months. He said that to me plainly, without sentiment. He said, the Velskar engineering teams had held the system together with work that should not have been possible with the resources available to them, and that they had bought the time that needed to be bought. I passed it on to Isaveth Kelm that evening. She received it the way professionals receive that kind of acknowledgement. With a slight tightening of the lattice, brief interior compression that I was beginning to recognize as the Velskar version of the effort, not to be visibly moved in a professional context, and said her engineers had tried very hard. I said I knew. She said it had not been enough. I said it had been enough to buy the time we needed to get there. She thought about that for a moment and then said, I had not considered it that way. I said, your engineers held the line. We picked it up from where they left it. She was quiet for a moment, then, yes, a pause. Yes, that is what happened. There was a quality in her voice when she said it that I have thought about since. Not relief. Exactly. Something older than relief. The quality of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told, by someone who has looked at the weight carefully, that the carrying was not in vain. That the thing they did while no one was watching mattered. That it counted. On day 34, I sent my reassessment to combined response. The atmospheric data showed we were ahead of the degradation curve. The hospital ship's intake was down 60% from peak and still dropping. The engineering core is expected to complete the primary reconstruction phase within another 45 days. Recommended transitioning to a maintenance posture, retaining 6 of the Nightingale ships, 4 atmospheric rigs, and a reduced engineering presence, while the remaining hulls stood down to auxiliary reserve status. Combined Response approved the recommendation within 12 hours and sent a brief reply that said, among other things, that the deployment had been assessed as successful and that the remaining asset commitment would be reviewed at 60-day intervals. Teen language. Efficient. Professional. I read it on my bridge and felt the particular satisfaction of a job that is going the way a job is supposed to go. It is not a dramatic satisfaction. It is the satisfaction of a system working as designed. I have learned, over 19 years in the auxiliary, that this is the satisfaction worth having, not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that requires catastrophe to produce, but the quiet functional kind that comes from doing the work right. What I did not know, could not know, was what Isaveth Kelm was doing at the same time. She told me about it afterward, when the maintenance posture transition was complete. And we had a final coordination meeting before I took the bulk of the convoy out of the system. She had been composing something for 3 weeks, she said. Since the day after we met in my briefing room, she had been drafting a formal account of the continuance's experience. Not a complaint, not a condemnation, not an editorial, an account, a precise, factual, documented record of 6 months of compact processes and 11 days of human response, and with the care and technical specificity that characterized all formal Velskar historical documentation. Dates, transmission logs, response times, manifests, equipment lists, atmospheric data, medical intake numbers, and a timeline laid beside a timeline, the compact's timeline, and Earth's. She had submitted it to the Compact's public record system 48 hours before our final meeting. The Compact's public record is accessible to every registered species and every credentialed institution that has Compact membership, which is most of the inhabited galaxy. I asked what the account said. She said, "It says what happened, exactly what happened. The transmissions, responses, the timeline, the equipment, the numbers. I have not editorialized, I have not made arguments, I have described events and outcomes. The facts speak for themselves," I said. "And," she said, "and I specified that the Human Convalescent Auxiliary received our Protocol 7 request Tuesday, that 8 days later 47 hulls arrived, that the deployment was classified by Human Combined Response as a light assistance deployment, standing posture, that the heavy posture option existed and was not deployed because the light posture was assessed as sufficient to address the documented need." I said. "How has it been received?" she said. "I received my first response from a member species diplomatic mission within 6 hours of posting. I have now received 412 formal inquiries from species governments, diplomatic offices, academic institutions, private parties requesting clarification on specific elements of the account." She paused. "Several of the inquiries are from species that have pending requests blanks in the Compact's emergency queue. 3 of the inquiries are from Compact member species that are themselves in the queue, have been in the queue for longer than the continuance was, and wish to understand the Protocol 7 filing procedure." Another pause, and something in her resonance changed. Not sharp, not dramatic. A long, slow deepening, like a crystal tone building toward its full frequency. "2 of the inquiries are from Compact Coordination itself," I said. "Does Compact Coordination want to know?" she said. "They want to know if the account is accurate." The light in her lattice had been building steadily over the weeks of the deployment. As the atmosphere improved, and the patient counts dropped, and the surface reconstruction progressed, was very bright now. Not the painful brightness of fracture stress, not the compressed interior point of a system under load, but the full internal illumination of a healthy, regulated Velskar physiology that has not been under catastrophic strain for the first time in a year. I replied that it was accurate in every particular. I offered to provide supporting documentation in any format required. I thought about this. I thought about what 412 formal inquiries meant, from species governments and diplomatic offices across the Compact, in response to a factual document. I thought about the species in the queue reading a precise account of what had happened to the continuance, running the same arithmetic that I had run on the manifest that Tuesday, seeing 47 hulls classified as light, understanding what that implied about the scale of what had not yet been deployed, understanding that the queue was not the only door. I thought about the phrase light assistance, standing posture, landing on 412 desks. I said, "Commander," she said. "Captain," I said. "I hope it is useful," she said. "The Velskar continuance intends to ensure it is useful. We have 800 years of documented Compact membership. We know how the record works. The record we have filed will remain accessible to every species with Compact credentials for as long as the system operates. It will be indexed. It will be cited." She held my gaze, the direct anterior orientation that serves that function for her species. "We were told for 6 months that help was not available, that the queue existed for a reason. That process has had to be respected." A long pause. "We want the record to reflect what happened when a process was bypassed by a human captain who flagged a routine request as priority 1 on a Tuesday morning," I said. "I just read the request," she said. "I know. That is in the record too." I did not know what to say to that. So again, I said nothing. The departure coordination took the rest of that day and the following morning. The hulls standing down from deployment status began their fold sequences at 1400 hours, and I watched the tactical plot thin out in reverse order from the way it had filled. Not emptying entirely. The 6 hospital ships and 4 rigs and engineering transports, remaining a reduced but sustained presence for the months of work still ahead. The acute phase was over. The crisis had been broken, but the repair was not done, and the continuance knew it, and so did we, and the people remaining knew what they were staying for. I took my ship out of the system in the late afternoon, standard operation time. The fold was routine. I had work to do. The post-deployment reports, the logistic reconciliation, the asset return protocols, the next queue entry already waiting. The kind of administrative work that fills the spaces between the things that matter and that is also, in its own way, the things that matter. I did not learn for another 3 weeks what Isavith Keln's account had done to the Compact's processes. I learned because Combined Response flagged an unusual pattern in incoming request volume and forwarded me a summary as mission lead of record for Deployment 7-9er. The summary was dry and carefully worded, the kind of language that institutional bodies produce when they are describing a significant development in the most neutral terms available. It said that, following the public distribution of a Velskar continuance account of Auxiliary Deployment 7-9er, the U.S. Convalescent Auxiliary had received 1,143 new access registrations from species that had not previously held auxiliary credentials. 47 of these registrations were from species governments with active requests in the Compact's emergency coordination queue. 6 Compact member species amended their existing emergency requests to include an auxiliary, Protocol 7, filing in parallel. The Combined Response Office was evaluating whether current asset levels were sufficient to meet projected request volume over the next 12 months. A capacity review had been scheduled. That was the institutional language. What it meant, translated out of institutional language into plain terms, was this. The Galaxy had read the document. The Galaxy had done the arithmetic. It had noted what 47 ships for a Protocol 7 request implied about what a Protocol 1 or a direct emergency filing might produce. It had looked at the phrase, light assistant standing posture, and understood that if this was light, then something else was possible, something the queue had not been providing, and now the Galaxy was asking. I do not know what the Compact made of it. I suspect the Compact made of it what institutions make of disruptions. A combination of procedural adaptation and careful documentation of concern. Suspect some of the concern was genuine. I suspect some of it was the kind of concern that institutions produce when they realize that the world has changed while they were managing the queue. I was not part of those conversations. I was writing my post-deployment reports and running my logistics reconciliation and preparing for the next assignment came in 10 days after I returned to port. Another Protocol 7 request from another species that had found us through the Compact's access directory. I read it carefully. I flagged it Priority 1 and sent it up the chain. Isavith Keln sent me a personal transmission 6 weeks after the deployment. It was brief, because the Velskar are brief when the facts carry what needs to be carried. She told me that the atmospheric readings, seen on Continuance Prime, had crossed the viability threshold for the first time in 14 months. She told me that the hospital ship's daily intake had reached 0 for 3 consecutive days. She told me that her engineers, her own people, working alongside the human core team, had completed the full surface reconstruction zone and were beginning the second. She told me that the Velskar continuance had received a formal communication from the Compact's coordination office acknowledging the circumstances, their case, and expressing a commitment to reviewing emergency response protocols. She did not comment on that. What she said at the end of the transmission was this. Captain Fenwick, I have been a student of the Compact's history for most of my professional life. I have read the founding documents. I have read the original emergency coordination frameworks, which were designed 300 years ago to ensure that no species would face a crisis alone. I read them again last month for the first time since the crisis began. I had not read them in some years, because they had stopped corresponding to my experience of how the Compact actually functions. I read them again because I wanted to see what they said, without the distance of disappointment. A pause in the recording. The founding documents say that the purpose of Compact coordination is to ensure that every species, regardless of standing, has access to the help they need, size to the need they have. That is the original language, to size to the need they have. Another pause. I had forgotten that was the purpose. I had forgotten it because, in my experience, the purpose had become size to the expectation, sides to the queue, sides to the political calculus. I had accepted that because it seemed to be how things were. A long silence. You did not accept it. You read a document on a Tuesday morning and you did not accept it. I have spent 6 weeks trying to decide what to call that. I have considered calling it policy. I have considered calling it training. I have considered calling it culture. I have considered calling it with the vocabulary my species uses for things that function, despite all evidence that they should not, Grace. The resonance in her voice shifted. The Velskar communicate modulation of meaning through tonal register. And what I heard in that last stretch of the recording was something I have heard from very few people in my career, of any species. The sound of someone saying a thing they have arrived at slowly and fully, with their full weight behind it and nothing held back. I had decided to call it what it is. It is what a person does when they believe that the purpose is real, and the scale is the point. You believe the purpose was real. You size the response to the need. A pause. I have included that in the record. Your name, your rank, the routing note you wrote. 2 lines. The 2 lines that started this. Another pause. The record will hold them for a long time, Captain. I wanted you to know. I sat with that for a while. Then I went back to work. There was a queue. There is always a queue, and the queue had changed.